Hey man, most people misunderstand how emotional consequences actually work over time, especially after a breakup. They assume pain peaks immediately and then fades evenly on both sides. That's not how it unfolds. What you feel early is shock, loss, and nervous system withdrawal. What she feels early is relief, certainty, and emotional justification. And that difference in timing is exactly why the weight shifts later, quietly, steadily, and inevitably. In the beginning, she feels lighter, not happier in a deep sense, but unburdened. The tension is gone, the uncertainty is gone, the emotional negotiations are gone. She tells herself she made the right decision because it feels right now. Emotional systems reward short-term relief immediately. They don't account for long-term consequences yet, and because of that, the early phase feels deceptively calm on her side. Meanwhile, your experience is inverted. You don't feel relief, you feel loss. Your system is still oriented toward the connection that ended. You replay conversations, you search for meaning. You feel the absence sharply because your emotional investment was still active when things ended. That's why it feels unfair at first, like she escaped the cost while you absorbed all of it. But emotional systems don't settle at the same pace. Relief is temporary. Once life stabilizes again, once distractions lose their novelty, once validation from the outside stops flooding in, the emotional debt resurfaces, and when it does, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It returns as reflection, as comparison, as quiet moments where the certainty she felt early begins to soften. This is where the timeline flips. You start rebuilding internally. Your nervous system slowly detaches. Your identity recenters. You stop expecting her presence. You regain direction. She, on the other hand, begins feeling the absence after the emotional noise settles, not because she misses the relationship exactly as it was, but because the long-term reality no longer matches the story she told herself at the beginning. Early on, she leaned on emotional justification. Later, she has to live with emotional outcomes, and outcomes don't care about justification. They reveal themselves through contrast. New connections feel less stable, attention feels conditional, conversations feel repetitive, and slowly, without trying to, her mind starts comparing, not romantically, but structurally. This is where regret often gets misunderstood. Regret doesn't mean she wants you back. It means she recognizes something was lost that can't be recreated easily. Stability, familiarity, emotional grounding, the things that don't feel dramatic while they're present, but feel irreplaceable once gone. And because those qualities take time to evaluate, the recognition arrives late. What intensifies this is that you're no longer participating in the emotional loop. You're not chasing, you're not explaining, you're not reacting. That absence removes any chance for emotional revision. She can't soften the ending. She can't reinterpret your behavior. The experience remains intact, and intact experiences are the ones that weigh the most over time. Men often assume the one who leaves escapes the pain. In reality, they postpone it, and postponed emotion doesn't disappear, it compounds. When it finally surfaces, it does so without distraction, without adrenaline, without narrative support, just clarity. And clarity, when delayed, is heavier than confusion ever was. So while it feels like she moved on effortlessly, and you're carrying everything now, the truth is more patient than that. You feel early because you were invested honestly. She feels later because emotional certainty collapses slowly. And over time, that delayed collapse is what makes the weight grow. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. As weeks pass, something subtle begins to change on her side. The certainty she once leaned on starts losing its sharpness. The decision that felt obvious now feels distant. Not wrong, not regrettable in an emotional sense, but incomplete. Life continues. Routines fill the space, and distractions do their job for a while. But distractions don't resolve emotional weight. They only delay its arrival. This is when comparison begins. Not intentionally, not nostalgically, but structurally. She notices how new interactions feel different, less grounded, less predictable, less familiar. The emotional environment no longer feels anchored, and without realizing it, her nervous system starts searching for the steadiness it once had. Not in you specifically, but in the experience you represented. What she starts missing isn't the relationship itself. It's the emotional regulation that came with it. The way things felt calmer when uncertainty arose, the way your presence absorbed tension without demanding constant explanation. Those qualities rarely feel important during the relationship. They only become visible in their absence. Meanwhile, you're moving through the opposite process. The pain that once dominated your thoughts begins to loosen its grip, not because you forgot, but because you adapted. You rebuilt routines without her. You stopped checking for signals. You stopped orienting your emotional state around something that no longer existed, and that internal adjustment is what creates long-term stability. This is where emotional timelines diverge completely. You're no longer emotionally living in the breakup. She's just beginning to process its meaning. And because she didn't feel the loss immediately, she doesn't have the same momentum toward rebuilding. She's still interpreting, still reassessing, still quietly recalibrating. What complicates this stage for her is that there's no clear emotional outlet. There's nothing dramatic to feel, no crisis to respond to, just a slow realization that something reliable exited her life without conflict. And endings without conflict are harder to emotionally resolve because they don't offer a villain. She may start revisiting moments that once felt insignificant, times you didn't react emotionally, times you stayed steady, times you didn't escalate tension. Those moments gain new meaning because they contrast with what she encounters now, and contrast is how emotional value is recognized, retroactively. At this point, regret doesn't arrive as desire to reconnect. It arrives as discomfort, a sense that something meaningful was underestimated, that she assumed she'd feel better than she does by now. And when expectation and reality don't match, the mind searches for explanation. What makes this harder is that you're no longer available to absorb that discomfort. You're not there to reassure her decision. You're not present to validate the narrative she used to move forward. The absence of your emotional participation forces her to sit with the outcome on her own. And this is when the weight begins to grow. Not explosively, not all at once, but steadily. Because while early relief fades, late clarity doesn't. It accumulates quietly, and the longer it sits unprocessed, the heavier it becomes. As this weight settles in, it starts changing how she experiences time itself. Days feel fuller on the surface, but emptier underneath. The busyness no longer masks the quiet moments the way it used to. And it's in those quiet moments that the realization surfaces, not as emotion, but as awareness. Awareness that something stable is missing and that its absence is now permanent. What makes this stage difficult is that there's nothing to fix, no conversation to reopen, no misunderstanding to clarify. The relationship didn't end in chaos, so there's no chaos to blame. It ended cleanly, and clean endings don't give the mind excuses. They force it to confront outcomes without emotional noise to hide behind. She may begin noticing how often she once leaned on your consistency without consciously acknowledging it, how easily she assumed it would always be there. Stability has a way of disappearing quietly when it's taken for granted, and once it's gone, it doesn't announce its value, it reveals it through contrast. At this point, even positive changes in her life don't land the way she expected. Achievements feel flatter, new connections feel temporary. The emotional satisfaction she assumed would come after the breakup doesn't quite arrive, and that gap between expectation and experience becomes impossible to ignore. This is where many people misunderstand emotional pain. It doesn't always come as sadness. Often it comes as dissatisfaction, a subtle sense that something isn't aligning the way it should. She may not feel miserable, but she doesn't feel settled either. And that unsettled feeling lingers longer than heartbreak ever does. Meanwhile, your emotional state continues stabilizing. You're no longer processing loss. You're integrating it. The lessons aren't loud anymore. They're embedded in how you move, how you choose, how you respond, and that integration creates a kind of quiet momentum that doesn't rely on validation. This contrast deepens her internal conflict. She assumed distance would bring freedom. Instead, it brought responsibility. Responsibility for choices that now have to be lived with rather than justified, and living with choices is far more demanding than making them. She may begin questioning whether she evaluated the situation correctly at the time, not because she wants to undo it, but because she didn't expect the emotional aftermath to unfold this way. The relief was supposed to last longer, the certainty was supposed to hold, and when it doesn't, doubt quietly replaces confidence. What intensifies this doubt is that you didn't spiral, you didn't collapse, you didn't remain emotionally available as a safety net. Your composure removes the option of emotional revision. She can't reinterpret the ending as mutual confusion or lingering attachment. Your behavior was too consistent for that, and so the emotional balance continues shifting. What you carried early, she begins carrying later, not because you transferred it to her, but because time redistributed it naturally. Emotional weight doesn't disappear, it moves, and over time, it moves toward the side that avoided feeling it in the beginning. As months pass, the emotional contrast sharpens instead of fading. What once felt like distance now feels like consequence. She's no longer comparing the present to the relationship itself, but to the emotional stability she once had access to. And that distinction matters. She isn't longing for you as a person. She's recognizing the absence of a certain emotional environment that hasn't reappeared elsewhere. This is when memory stops being selective and starts being honest. The small moments you shared, routine conversations, quiet presence, emotional steadiness, take on new weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were dependable. Dependability rarely announces its value while it's present. It reveals itself only when it's no longer there to lean on. What she begins to feel now isn't regret in the romantic sense. It's recognition that some losses don't hurt immediately, because they don't disrupt momentum, they disrupt foundation. And when foundation shifts, the impact shows up later, in subtle dissatisfaction rather than acute pain. At this stage, distraction loses its power entirely. New attention feels surface level, validation feels temporary, even excitement feels hollow if it lacks continuity. And continuity is something she now understands differently, not as time spent together, but as emotional reliability over time. This realization often arrives during moments of calm, not crisis, when there's no emotional urgency demanding focus, when life is quiet enough for reflection to surface naturally. And when it does, it doesn't ask questions. It delivers answers she wasn't seeking, but can't ignore. Meanwhile, you're operating from a different internal position altogether. The pain that once demanded explanation has transformed into clarity. You don't romanticize the past. You don't minimize it either. You've placed it accurately within your life story, and accuracy creates peace where emotion once lived. This difference in processing creates an asymmetry she can feel but not articulate. You've moved forward with internal alignment, she's still integrating meaning. And because integration happens slower than reaction, her emotional experience lags behind yours. What complicates this stage is that there's no corrective action available. She can't rewind time, she can't revisit the dynamic without disrupting her own narrative. The realization has to be carried quietly, and carrying something quietly is often heavier than expressing it openly. She may now understand that leaving wasn't the mistake. Underestimating the cost was. Emotional costs don't announce themselves up front. They reveal themselves through absence, contrast, and time, and by the time they're fully felt, the situation that created them is already settled. This is when the phrase, "it gets worse over time," finally makes sense. Not worse in intensity, but in clarity. Because clarity removes comfort, and once comfort is gone, the truth of what was lost becomes impossible to soften. As clarity deepens, the emotional weight becomes less chaotic and more precise. She no longer feels confused about why she feels unsettled. She understands that something meaningful ended without replacement, and replacement is the key word here. People assume time replaces what's lost. It doesn't. Time only removes distraction. What remains afterward is truth. This is where her emotional state begins to feel heavier, not because she's overwhelmed, but because she's aware. Awareness adds gravity to experience. She can no longer tell herself she simply moved on. She can no longer pretend the absence doesn't matter. The narrative that once protected her comfort starts losing credibility. At this point, she may notice how often she thought she would feel happier by now, how she expected relief to turn into fulfillment. But fulfillment doesn't come from escape, it comes from alignment. And alignment, once broken, doesn't restore itself through novelty or attention. What hurts most at this stage isn't the breakup, it's the delayed understanding, the realization that something solid was exchanged for something uncertain. That certainty was mistaken for stagnation, that stability was undervalued because it didn't demand attention, and late realizations always feel heavier than early mistakes. Meanwhile, you're experiencing the inverse. What once felt unbearable now feels distant. You don't wake up with questions looping in your mind anymore. You don't replay conversations. You don't search for closure. Your nervous system has adapted to reality, and adaptation is what allows pain to fade without denial. This contrast intensifies her internal conflict. She may become aware that you seem more grounded now than you did before. Not outwardly, not performatively, but internally. That awareness adds another layer of weight because it confirms that growth occurred on your side while she remained emotionally suspended. This doesn't create jealousy, it creates reflection. Reflection about timing, about emotional investment, about the cost of delaying commitment while assuming availability. These reflections don't produce dramatic emotion. They produce quiet recalibration. At this stage, the breakup no longer feels like an event, it feels like a turning point, a moment that subtly redirected emotional trajectory. And turning points carry significance precisely because they can't be revisited without changing the entire path that followed. She may now understand that pain delayed isn't pain avoided, it's pain accumulated. And accumulated pain doesn't explode, it settles. It becomes part of how choices are evaluated going forward. It shapes caution, hesitation, and awareness in ways that aren't immediately visible. This is why the emotional experience grows heavier over time. Not because feelings intensify, but because illusions dissolve. And when illusions dissolve, what's left is reality, clear, quiet, and impossible to ignore. As reality settles in, she begins to feel a kind of emotional density that wasn't there before. It's not sadness in the traditional sense, it's weight without drama, the kind that follows her quietly rather than overwhelming her. She goes about her days normally, but there's an undercurrent of awareness now, an understanding that something foundational shifted and never returned. This is where the mind stops trying to escape the feeling and starts accommodating it. She doesn't fight it anymore, she carries it. And carrying something internally for long enough changes how it's perceived. It becomes part of her emotional baseline, not something to react to, but something to live with. What makes this heavier than early heartbreak is that there's no urgency to release it. Early pain demands action, conversation, distraction, reassurance. Late clarity doesn't. It simply exists, and what exists without an outlet tends to sink deeper, not louder. She may now understand that the breakup didn't fail her expectations immediately, it outpaced them. The consequences arrived after the emotional justification expired, and when justification fades, accountability doesn't rush in aggressively, it arrives calmly, with time on its side. Meanwhile, your emotional state has moved into something stable and self-contained. You're no longer measuring progress in terms of pain reduction, you're measuring it in clarity and direction. You don't feel lighter because something was removed. You feel steadier because something unnecessary stopped pulling at you. This difference becomes unmistakable over time. She feels slower emotionally, more cautious, less certain. You feel clearer, more decisive, more internally anchored. And that contrast isn't about superiority, it's about timing. You process the loss when it happened. She's processing the meaning after the fact. At this stage, even neutral memories begin to carry significance. Moments that once felt ordinary now feel instructive. She understands how easily something stable can be mistaken for something static, and that understanding doesn't fade. It informs how she evaluates connections going forward. What she carries now isn't longing for the past, it's awareness of cost. Awareness that some choices don't hurt because they're wrong, but because they're final. And finality, when fully realized, brings a quiet seriousness to emotional life. You, on the other hand, are no longer living in reaction to the past. You've integrated it into how you move. You don't need distance to maintain clarity anymore. Clarity is already internal, and internal clarity doesn't fluctuate with memory. This is why the experience continues to feel heavier on her side over time, not because pain grows, but because understanding deepens, and deep understanding, once settled, carries more weight than emotion ever did in the beginning. As this deeper understanding settles, she begins to experience a quiet recalibration of her emotional expectations. What once felt acceptable now feels thin. What once felt exciting now feels unstable. And this shift doesn't happen because she's unhappy, it happens because she's more aware. Awareness changes tolerance, it refines what feels worth investing in and what feels like emotional noise. She may now notice how often she assumed time would soften everything. That distance would automatically create peace, that moving on would feel cleaner than it does. And when those assumptions fail, the mind doesn't panic, it adjusts. But adjustment requires acknowledging that the early certainty wasn't as accurate as it felt. This is where emotional accountability takes shape. Not in the form of self-blame, but in the form of honesty. Honest recognition that some dynamics only reveal their value after they're gone. Honest recognition that relief is not the same as resolution, and that recognition doesn't disappear, it integrates. Meanwhile, your experience continues to trend in the opposite direction. The emotional load that once felt overwhelming has redistributed itself into perspective. You don't feel victorious, you don't feel vindicated, you feel aligned, and alignment is quiet. It doesn't announce progress, it demonstrates it through steadiness. This difference in internal states becomes more pronounced with time. She carries awareness that arrived late, you carry clarity that arrived early. And because clarity was processed when the loss occurred, it no longer weighs on you. Awareness, arriving later, settles more slowly. At this stage, she may find herself reflecting not on the relationship itself, but on her decision-making process, on how emotional certainty can be misleading, on how comfort can masquerade as confidence. These reflections don't demand emotional release, they demand recalibration. This recalibration influences how she moves forward. She may become more cautious, more observant, less willing to assume stability without evidence, and while that caution may protect her, it also carries the weight of learning something through loss rather than foresight. What remains unresolved isn't the connection, it's the timing. The understanding arrived after the opportunity passed, and late understanding is heavier than early pain because it can't be acted on, it can only be carried. You, however, are no longer carrying anything unresolved. You processed the emotional cost when it was active. You allowed it to run its course. And because of that, the past no longer intrudes on your present. It informs without interrupting. This is why, over time, the emotional experience shifts disproportionately. You feel lighter, not because the past disappeared, but because it settled. She feels heavier, not because pain increased, but because truth arrived without distraction. And truth, once fully understood, always has weight. As that truth settles, her emotional world becomes quieter but more serious. The noise is gone, but so is the comfort that noise once provided. There's no dramatic sadness to process, no crisis demanding action, just a steady awareness that something meaningful was misjudged. And misjudgment, once recognized, doesn't fade, it reshapes how the mind evaluates everything that follows. She may begin to notice how differently she responds to new connections now. Where she once moved easily, she hesitates. Where she once assumed stability, she looks for proof. This isn't fear, it's consequence. Experience has recalibrated her expectations, and recalibration always carries weight because it's built on what can't be undone. What's difficult about this stage is that there's no emotional release valve. Early pain has outlets: talking, venting, distraction, expression. Late understanding doesn't ask to be expressed, it asks to be lived with. And living with something quietly is heavier than expressing it loudly. She may now understand that what she felt early wasn't strength, it was relief. Relief from tension, from uncertainty, from emotional responsibility. And relief feels convincing in the moment because it mimics clarity, but clarity holds up over time. Relief expires, and once it does, whatever was postponed returns. This is where the emotional cost becomes undeniable. Not as regret, not as longing, but as seriousness. A seriousness about choice, about timing, about how easily something stable can be dismissed when it doesn't demand attention. That seriousness changes how future decisions are made, but it arrives carrying the weight of hindsight. Meanwhile, your emotional position continues to feel lighter and more grounded. Not because you won, but because you finished processing when it mattered. You didn't delay the pain, you didn't avoid it, you let it move through you when it was active, and because of that, it didn't linger. This difference creates an unspoken asymmetry. You're oriented toward the present. She's still integrating the past, and integration takes time when it's done quietly. There's no rush, there's no drama, just gradual acceptance of what is and what isn't anymore. At this stage, the idea of moving on takes on a different meaning for her. It's no longer about distance from you, it's about adjusting to a new internal reality, one where choices feel heavier, where assumptions are questioned, where certainty is no longer taken for granted. For you, the chapter feels closed, not emotionally erased, but settled. You carry the lesson without carrying the weight, and that's the difference most people miss. Closure doesn't come from understanding everything, it comes from integrating what mattered and releasing what didn't. This is why, over time, the emotional balance continues to shift. You move forward with increasing steadiness. She moves forward with increasing awareness. And awareness, when it arrives late, always feels heavier than pain that was felt early and allowed to pass. As this awareness deepens, she begins to sense that the emotional landscape she's moving through now is less forgiving than before. Not harsher, but more honest. There's no emotional padding left. No assumptions smoothing the edges. Every choice feels more deliberate because she understands now that consequences don't always announce themselves immediately. They arrive when distraction fades. She may notice that even moments of happiness carry a quieter tone, not diminished, but tempered. There's an underlying seriousness now, a recognition that emotional comfort can't be borrowed indefinitely. That seriousness doesn't ruin joy, it grounds it, but grounding joy comes at the cost of innocence, and innocence once lost doesn't return. This is where the emotional experience becomes heavier without becoming painful. Pain demands reaction, heaviness demands endurance. She's not hurting in a way that seeks relief. She's carrying understanding in a way that reshapes her emotional posture, and posture once changed influences everything that follows. What stands out most in hindsight is how quietly everything unfolded. No dramatic mistakes, no obvious turning points, just a series of small assumptions that added up to a large outcome. And large outcomes built quietly often feel more permanent than those built through chaos. At this stage, she may fully recognize that what she lost wasn't the relationship, it was the version of herself that felt emotionally secure within it. That security wasn't guaranteed by circumstance, it was supported by consistency. And consistency, once gone, is difficult to recreate authentically. Meanwhile, your emotional state reflects something different entirely. You don't feel lighter because you escaped responsibility. You feel lighter because you carried it when it was present. You faced the discomfort early. You didn't postpone it, and that early processing prevented it from becoming a long-term burden. This contrast clarifies the truth. Most people never articulate. Emotional pain delayed doesn't disappear, it matures. It becomes quieter, more refined, more integrated into identity. And maturity carries weight, not dramatic weight, but existential weight. She now moves through life with that maturity, whether she recognizes it or not. Her decisions are informed by experience rather than assumption. Her expectations are tempered by reality rather than hope, and that tempering is the result of understanding arriving later than comfort. For you, the past no longer holds emotional authority. It informed you, but it doesn't follow you. You're not haunted by what happened. You're guided by what it revealed, and guidance feels lighter than regret because it points forward instead of backward. This is why the emotional experience continues to feel heavier on her side over time. Not because suffering increases, but because awareness solidifies, and solid awareness once formed doesn't fluctuate. It becomes part of how life is felt, steady, grounded, and undeniably real. By this point, the emotional journey reaches its most settled form. There's no longer resistance, denial, or questioning. What remains is acceptance, not emotional resignation, but factual acceptance. She understands that the outcome wasn't unfair or sudden. It unfolded exactly as it was allowed to unfold, and that realization carries a quiet finality. This is where the weight becomes permanent, not oppressive. Permanent in the sense that it no longer needs to be processed. It's already integrated. It shapes perception rather than emotion. She doesn't feel haunted by the past. She feels informed by it, and being informed through loss changes how future choices are approached. She may now see clearly that what she felt at the beginning wasn't strength or clarity, but momentum. Momentum always feels convincing while it's moving, but when it slows, reality catches up. And when reality arrives after momentum fades, it brings understanding without comfort. At this stage, even the idea of regret becomes irrelevant. There's nothing to undo, nothing to repair. The awareness exists without urgency. It doesn't push her toward action. It simply stays present as context. And context quietly influences everything that comes next. Meanwhile, your internal state feels complete, not triumphant, not superior, just complete. You're no longer carrying emotional residue from the breakup. The lessons have settled, the pain has passed. What remains is alignment between what you expect, what you tolerate, and how you move. This alignment gives you a kind of emotional neutrality that most people mistake for indifference. In reality, it's freedom from emotional drag. You're not pulled backward by memory or forward by fantasy. You're anchored in what is, and that anchoring creates stability that compounds over time. She, on the other hand, carries understanding that arrived too late to change the outcome, and late understanding always weighs more than early pain. Pain can be released. Understanding must be lived with. It becomes part of how meaning is constructed going forward. This is why, over time, the emotional scales tip quietly but decisively. You grow lighter, not because you forgot, but because you integrated. She grows heavier, not because she's suffering, but because she's aware. And awareness doesn't shout, it settles. There's no villain in this story. No one needed to lose for this shift to occur. Emotional timelines are simply unequal. One side feels early and heals early. The other avoids feeling and understands later. And time always redistributes what was postponed. So when it's said that your ex will always feel worse over time, it doesn't mean misery or longing. It means weight. The weight of understanding what stability meant only after it was gone, and that weight, once fully realized, never needs to hurt to be felt.